The Christmas Eve Vanishing, and Hercule Poirot Mystery Part 1. The Vanishing Christmas Eve arrived in Bramley-on-Avon beneath a sky the color of dull pewter, heavy with the promise of snow. By mid-afternoon, the first flakes had begun to fall, hesitant at first, then more confidently, settling upon the hedgerows, the slate rooftops, and the narrow lanes that wound like pale ribbons through the countryside. The village itself looked as though it had stepped out of a Christmas card, shop windows trimmed with holly, wreaths hanging upon every door, and lanterns glowing softly as dusk crept in. Yet beneath this carefully arranged cheer, something uneasy stirred, though no one could yet have said what it was. At Ravenscroft House. The unease had already taken root. Ravenscroft stood a little apart from the village, an elegant Georgian house set back from the road, its long windows glowing warmly against the falling snow. It was a house accustomed to gatherings, to dinners and polite conversation. And on this Christmas Eve it was filled with voices once more. At precisely 6:30, Mrs. Eleanor Harrington vanished. Eleanor Harrington was not a woman who vanished. At 48. She possessed the composed certainty of someone firmly anchored in the world. She was tall, striking rather than beautiful, with steel-gray eyes and hair swept into a perfectly controlled chignon. She managed Ravenscroft House, and indeed the Harrington family itself, with an authority so quiet that few ever questioned it. She was a widow of 7 years. Her late husband having left behind a respectable fortune, a complicated family, and a legacy of expectations Eleanor had fulfilled with admirable discipline. On Christmas Eve, she was hosting dinner. The guests were few but carefully chosen. Her stepson, Julian Harrington, 32, charming, restless, and perpetually dissatisfied with the limits of his allowance. Her niece, Margaret Cole, a pale, observant woman of 29, who had lived at Ravenscroft since childhood and seemed to move through the house like a shadow. Dr. Arthur Bell, the family physician, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes and the manner of someone who had learned to keep secrets. And finally, Mrs. Winifred Lacey, Eleanor's longtime companion and secretary, a woman so unobtrusive that she often escaped notice entirely. Dinner had begun at 7. At 7:45. Eleanor excused herself. At 8 o'clock. She was gone. It was Margaret who first noticed. She sat at the long dining table, fingers resting lightly on her napkin, listening to Julian complain about London rents with exaggerated despair. The candles flickered. The fire hissed softly in the grate. She said she'd only be a moment, Margaret murmured. Mrs. Lacey glanced up. Mrs. Harrington? Yes, Julian frowned. She probably went to fetch something. You know how she is. But Margaret was already uneasy. Eleanor Harrington did nothing without explanation, and she never lingered. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Dr. Bell cleared his throat. Perhaps I should see if she's unwell. They rose together and stepped into the hall. The grandfather clock ticked loudly, each second suddenly intrusive. The front door remained bolted, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the cold. Snow pressed softly against the glass. Mrs. Lacey knocked upon the door of Eleanor's study. No answer. Margaret tried the handle. Locked. She never locks it. Margaret said quietly. Julian's expression shifted, irritation giving way to something sharper. Don't be ridiculous. Dr. Bell tried the handle himself. Firmly locked. A silence fell, the kind that grows teeth. The house was searched thoroughly. Eleanor's bedroom lay undisturbed, the bed neatly made, her jewelry box untouched. The servants' quarters revealed nothing. The back door was locked and bolted from the inside, its key hanging precisely where Eleanor always kept it. There were no signs of struggle. No note. No trace. At 9 o'clock. Julian telephoned the local constabulary. By 9:30, Inspector Harold Finch arrived, stamping snow from his boots and bringing with him the chill certainty of official attention. A disappearance, you say? Yes, Julian replied sharply. From a locked house. Inspector Finch raised his eyebrows. People don't generally vanish into thin air, Mr. Harrington. No, said a quiet voice from the doorway. They do not. All turned. The speaker was a small, meticulously dressed man with an egg-shaped head and a magnificent mustache. Snow dusted his overcoat. His eyes were sharp and alert. I am Hercule Poirot, he said politely. And I fear, Inspector, that this disappearance will prove most inconvenient. Ivy Poirot's presence at Ravenscroft was, at first glance, coincidence. He had arrived in Bramley-on-Avon that afternoon, intending nothing more strenuous than a peaceful Christmas in the country. The snowstorm had delayed his onward journey, forcing him to accept lodging at the modest King's Arms Inn. Poirot had learned long ago that coincidence was merely another word for design. I was enjoying a most agreeable cup of chocolate, he explained, when I overheard your landlord speaking of alarm at Ravenscroft House, a vanishing woman. On Christmas Eve, a bean, it called to me. Inspector Finch snorted. With respect, Monsieur Poirot, this is a local matter. Poirot smiled serenely. Naturally. I shall only observe. My little gray cells do so enjoy the exercise. Eleanor Harrington's study was unlocked by force under Finch's supervision. Inside, the room was neat to the point of austerity. Papers were stacked precisely, the desk blotter immaculate. A small fire had burned low in the grate. Poirot noticed everything, the absence of disorder, the chair drawn back slightly, as though someone had risen calmly. And upon the desk, a single sheet of paper. Blank, a curious thing, Poirot murmured. A blank page is never truly blank, Inspector. It is full of intentions. The questions followed. Mrs. Lacey, pale and trembling, insisted Eleanor had been perfectly well. She mentioned a headache, nothing more. Margaret recalled a strange tension during dinner, a glance between Eleanor and Julian. She could not explain. Julian bristled under questioning. My stepmother had no enemies. She was respected. Respected people, Poirot said gently, often inspire the strongest resentments. Dr. Bell remained composed, perhaps too composed. He confirmed Eleanor's health was generally excellent, though he admitted she had been under considerable strain. What strain? Poirot asked. Dr. Bell hesitated. Family matters. Poirot inclined his head. Ah, toujours family matters. VI outside. The snow fell harder now, sealing Ravenscroft off from the world. Roads became impassable. Telegraph lines sagged beneath the weight. Inspector Finch made a grim announcement. No one leaves until morning. Poirot nodded approvingly. Excellent. The truth, Inspector dislikes movement. It prefers stillness. As the household retired uneasily for the night, Poirot remained awake, seated in a high-backed chair near the dying fire. In his mind, he reconstructed the moment. 7:40-5. Eleanor Harrington raises. She excuses herself. She walks into the hall. And then, nothing. No, Poirot murmured softly to himself. Not nothing. Something very precise. He stood and examined the hall once more, and then he saw it. A faint mark upon the polished floor, not a footprint, but the subtle disturbance of something heavy dragged briefly. Carefully, Poirot smiled, though his eyes were grave. The vanishing, he said softly, is only the beginning. Part 2. The last dinner. The night settled over Ravenscroft. House like a held breath. Snow pressed insistently against the windows, blurring the world beyond into a white, formless void. Inside, the lamps glowed with a deceptive warmth, casting long shadows that clung to the walls and corners as though unwilling to let go. Households slept, or pretended to. Hercule Poirot did neither. Poirot had always maintained that the truth revealed itself most clearly not in action, but in reflection. While Inspector Finch retired to the guest room with a notebook full of half-formed conclusions, Poirot remained in the drawing room, his small figure almost swallowed by a vast armchair. He closed his eyes and returned. In his mind, to the dinner table. "The last dinner," he murmured. "Always, it is there that the seeds are planted." He reconstructed it meticulously, the placement of chairs, the arrangement of candles, the precise tone of each voice. To Poirot, memory was not vague or impressionistic, it was architectural. Every moment had structure, proportion, and intention. 7 o'clock, they had gathered promptly. Eleanor Harrington at the head of the table, immaculate in dark green silk. She had surveyed them all with her usual composed authority, smiling just enough to be gracious, never enough to invite familiarity. Julian Harrington had arrived late, apologetic but not repentant, trailing cold air and impatience behind him. Margaret Cole had taken her place quietly, eyes observant, lips pressed together. Dr. Bell had appeared tired, distracted, his fork pausing too often mid her, and Mrs. Lacey. Mrs. Lacey had hovered, as always, half present, half absent, like a footnote to the evening. Poirot opened his eyes. "Yes," he said softly. "It is all there." Breakfast the next morning was a constrained affair. Inspector Finch insisted everyone be present, a decision that was met with thinly veiled resentment, particularly from Julian. "This is absurd," Julian snapped, buttering toast with unnecessary force. "My stepmother may have gone for a walk or decided to visit someone. She was prone to dramatic gestures." Poirot regarded him over the rim of his teacup. "On Christmas Eve? In a snowstorm? Without her coat?" Julian flushed. "You don't know Eleanor as I did." "Indeed," Poirot agreed calmly. "That is why I listen." Margaret ate little. Her eyes flicked from face to face as though she were memorizing them. Dr. Bell stirred his coffee repeatedly, though the sugar had long since dissolved. Mrs. Lacey did not touch her plate at all. Inspector Finch cleared his throat. "I'll be asking each of you to recount last night's dinner, in detail." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, excellent. Repetition is most illuminating." Margaret was first. They spoke in the morning room, pale light filtering through frost-laced windows. "I remember Eleanor was tense," Margaret said slowly. "Not outwardly. But I've lived with her long enough to notice." "In what way?" Poirot asked gently. "She kept adjusting her ring, twisting it. She only does that when she's troubled." Inspector Finch scribbled something down. Poirot leaned forward. "And the conversation?" Margaret hesitated. "It was ordinary, too ordinary." Julian spoke about money. Dr. Bell about the weather. Mrs. Lacey hardly spoke at all. "But," Poirot prompted. Margaret swallowed. "But at one point, Eleanor said something strange." "What was that, mademoiselle?" "She said, some matters must be settled before the year ends." Inspector Finch looked up sharply. "That's important." Poirot nodded. "Yes, but not in the way you think." Ivy Julian's interview was far less restrained. "She was controlling," he said bitterly. "Even after my father's death. Everything had to be done her way." "And yet," Poirot said mildly, "you dined with her willingly." Julian laughed harshly. "Because the will hadn't been amended, yet." Inspector Finch froze. "What do you mean by that?" Julian shrugged. Eleanor had been considering changes. She never said so directly, but she hinted. Poirot's mustache twitched. "Hints are the most dangerous form of communication, Nan." Julian scowled. "Are you suggesting I wanted her gone?" "I suggest nothing," Poirot replied serenely. "I observe." VDR. Bell was next. He answered questions politely, professionally, too professionally. "She complained of headaches," he said. "Stress-related, most likely." Poirot tilted his head. "And the dinner conversation?" "Unremarkable." Poirot smiled. "Doctor, forgive me, but unremarkable evenings do not precede remarkable disappearances." Dr. Bell's jaw tightened. Eleanor was worried. "About?" "About the past," Bell said quietly. Inspector Finch leaned forward. "Explain." Dr. Bell shook his head. "I can't. Patient confidentiality." Poirot regarded him steadily. "Confidentiality ends where danger begins, Doctor." For a moment, Bell looked as though he might speak, then he fell silent. Mrs. Lacey trembled visibly during her questioning. "She was kind to me," she whispered. "People don't see it, but she was." Poirot nodded. Kindness often wears stern clothing. Mrs. Lacey clasped her hands. "She asked me to prepare some papers earlier that day." "What papers?" Inspector Finch demanded. Mrs. Lacey hesitated. "Personal ones, letters." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Letters to whom?" "I don't know," she said quickly. "They were sealed." Poirot exchanged a glance with Finch. "Were these letters still in the study?" Poirot asked. Mrs. Lacey shook her head. "No, she took them with her." Silence fell. Poirot broke it softly. "Then perhaps, Ms. Amos, we must ask, where did she intend to take them?" That afternoon, Poirot returned alone to the dining room. He walked slowly around the table, stopping at each chair, imagining the person who had occupied it. In Eleanor's place. He paused. There was a faint scratch on the polished wood, newly made. Poirot knelt, peering closer. "A ring," he murmured. Struck in agitation, he straightened, his eyes distant. The dinner had not been merely a meal. It had been a confrontation, quiet, restrained, but no less fierce for its civility. Someone at that table had known something, and Eleanor Harrington had known that they knew. By evening, the snow had cut Ravenscroft off entirely. No trains, no roads, no visitors. Inspector Finch grew restless. "We'll search again," he announced. "Every inch." Poirot raised a finger. "Inspector, may I suggest something first?" Finch sighed. "What now?" "Let us recreate the dinner." The inspector blinked. "You mean—" "Yes," Poirot said. "Same places, same order. Same words, if possible." "That's ridiculous." Poirot's gaze was unwavering. "Truth, Inspector, often appears ridiculous just before it becomes inevitable." Reluctantly, Finch agreed. The table was set once more, and as they took their seats, a strange thing happened. The room seemed to tighten around them, the past pressed close, and for just a moment, Poirot could almost see Eleanor Harrington again, seated at the head, watching, waiting. Poirot studied them all, Julian's restless defiance, Margaret's quiet fear, Dr. Bell's guarded restraint, Mrs. Lacey's near invisibility, and, Poirot thought, one of you knew this was a farewell. He folded his hands. "Ms. Amos," he said softly, "last night was not the end. It was the beginning." No one spoke. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing tracks, hiding paths, preserving secrets. But Poirot smiled faintly. Snow, he knew, never hid the truth forever. It only delayed its revelation. Part 3. A house full of secrets. Ravenscroft House had always been a place of order. That, Poirot reflected, was precisely why it concealed disorder so well. Morning arrived reluctantly, as though even the day itself hesitated to intrude upon what had occurred. Snow lay deep against the windows, sealing the house in a white silence that seemed unnatural in its completeness. Poirot stood at the foot of the main staircase, surveying the interior with professional interest. "A house," he said softly, "is like a face. It shows what it wishes to show. But the truth, the truth lives in the lines, the shadows, the places one avoids looking." Inspector Finch joined him, stamping his feet against the cold. "We've searched twice," Finch said irritably. "There's nowhere left." Poirot turned, his expression polite but firm. "Inspector, we have searched for a body. We have not yet searched for a story." Finch grimaced. "What do you propose?" Poirot gestured upward. "We begin with the rooms Eleanor Harrington controlled most closely." Eleanor's bedroom was pristine. Too pristine. The bed was perfectly made. the wardrobe meticulously arranged. Not a single garment lay out of place. Poirot ran a gloved finger along the mantelpiece. No woman, he said thoughtfully, retires on Christmas Eve without leaving some small disorder behind. A ribbon, a brush, a thought unfinished. Inspector Finch frowned. You're suggesting she didn't intend to return. I suggest, Poirot replied, that she prepared for something. He opened the wardrobe. At first glance, nothing was missing. But Poirot stepped back, counting silently. One coat, he said. Finch blinked. Pardon? One winter coat is missing, Poirot repeated. The gray one with the fox fur collar. Finch looked startled. How can you be sure? Poirot smiled faintly. Because the others leaned slightly inward. This space, he tapped the empty gap, is new. But no one saw her leave. Poirot inclined his head. Just so. Margaret Cole's room was next. It was smaller, plainer, lived in a way Eleanor's was not. Books lay stacked beside the bed, their spines cracked from frequent reading. A half-finished letter rested on the desk. Poirot paused. This, he said gently, lifting the paper, is interesting. Inspector Finch peered over his shoulder. It's blank. Not blank, Poirot corrected. Unfinished. Margaret appeared at the doorway, pale and composed. I couldn't sleep, she said quietly. Poirot turned. To whom were you writing, mademoiselle? Margaret hesitated. No one important. Poirot nodded. It is always the unimportant people who carry the greatest truths. She swallowed. If you must know, I was writing to myself. Trying to understand. Things, what things? Margaret's voice trembled. Aunt Eleanor was afraid. Of what? Of exposure, Margaret said. Inspector Finch stiffened. Exposure of what? Margaret shook her head. I don't know. But she kept saying, everything hidden has its season. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Did she say this before she vanished? Yes. IVDR. Belle's room smelled faintly of antiseptic. Poirot noticed it immediately. A curious choice of scent for a guest room. He remarked. Belle stiffened. Old habit. Poirot examined Belle's medical bag, placed carefully beside the bed. May I? He asked. Belle hesitated. Just a fraction too long. Inside were the expected instruments. Bottles. Vials. Poirot lifted one delicately. A sedative, he observed. Prescribed? Belle's voice was even. Yes, for emergencies. Poirot replaced it carefully. Emergencies often arrive unannounced. Belle met Poirot's gaze. Are you accusing me? Poirot smiled politely. No, doctor. I am listening. Mrs. Lacey's room told a different story altogether. It was spare, almost monastic. A single suitcase lay open upon the bed. Inspector Finch frowned. You were planning to leave? Mrs. Lacey wrung her hands. After Christmas, Mrs. Harrington had released me. Poirot tilted his head. Released you? She said my services were no longer required. When did she tell you this? Yesterday morning. Poirot's mustache twitched. And yet she entrusted you with letters later that same day. Mrs. Lacey's eyes filled with tears. I don't understand it either. Poirot glanced at the suitcase. May I ask, he said gently, why it is already packed? Mrs. Lacey whispered, because I was afraid. Viva's servant's wing yielded little until Poirot noticed a narrow door at the far end of the corridor. What is this? He asked. A storage room, Finch said. Empty. Poirot tried the handle, locked. Empty rooms, Poirot murmured. Rarely require locks. The door was forced. Inside. Dust lay thick, except for one patch near the wall. Poirot crouched. Examining faint scuff marks, something heavy was moved, he said. Recently. Inspector Finch stared. You think she was brought here? No, Poirot replied quietly. I think she was hidden here. Briefly. Why briefly? Poirot gestured to the dust. Because this room was not the destination. VII by afternoon, tensions had sharpened. Julian cornered Poirot in the hall. This is absurd, he snapped. You're turning the house upside down. Poirot regarded him calmly. Truth often feels like upheaval, Monsieur Julian. Julian's voice dropped. You think one of us did this? Poirot nodded. Yes, Julian laughed sharply. Then you're wasting your time. Poirot leaned closer. Am I? You see, monsieur, guilt has a habit of betraying itself, not through action, but through reaction. Julian's jaw tightened. What do you want from me? Poirot smiled gently. Patience. VII that evening, Poirot gathered everyone in the drawing room. I will ask only one question, he announced. They watched him warily. Who among you, Poirot said slowly, knew that Eleanor Harrington intended to leave Ravenscroft House forever? Silence. Margaret's breath caught Mrs. Lacey's hands. Trembled. Dr. Bell stared at the floor. Julian said nothing. Poirot nodded to himself. Merci, he said softly. That is quite enough for today. Inspector Finch stared at him. That's it? Poirot smiled. Inspector, we have discovered something invaluable. What? That Eleanor Harrington did not vanish by accident. He turned toward the staircase. She was preparing an exit. I late that night. Poirot returned once more to Eleanor's study. He examined the desk carefully. At last, he pressed gently upon the blotter. A hidden compartment slid open. Inside lay a single item, a photograph. Poirot studied it. His expression grave. Ah, he murmured. So this is what frightened you, madame. He replaced the photograph and closed the compartment. The house, he said softly, is full of secrets. And one of them, he knew, was about to demand its price. Part 4. The False Trail. Discovery was made at precisely 11 minutes past 9. Inspector Finch would later remember the time exactly, because it was the moment the case seemed at last to make sense. And Poirot knew, at that same instant, that it made no sense at all. The storm had eased during the night, but the snow lay deep and treacherous. A pale winter sun filtered weakly through the clouds, illuminating Ravenscroft's grounds in deceptive calm. Constable Harris came running from the far end of the property, his breath sharp with urgency. Inspector, we found something. Finch was already pulling on his coat. Poirot followed more slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes thoughtful. They reached the old tool shed near the frozen river bank, a neglected structure half swallowed by ivy and snow. Inside, the air was bitter and stale, and there, lying upon the cold earth floor, was a woman's coat. Gray, with a fox fur collar, Eleanor Harrington's coat. Inspector Finch let out a long breath. Well, he said grimly, that settles it. Poirot said nothing. The coat was carefully laid out upon a crate. One sleeve was torn. The hem was damp, stiff with frost. Dragged, Finch muttered. Looks like a struggle. Poirot crouched, examining the ground. No, he said quietly. It looks like an imitation of a struggle. Finch frowned. You're overthinking. Poirot touched the torn sleeve gently. This tear was made deliberately, clean, controlled. He sniffed the fur collar. And this, he added, has been exposed to cold air, but not water. Finch waved a dismissive hand. She went out, slipped, fell into the river. Poirot rose slowly. Inspector, if Madame Harrington had fallen into the river, the coat would smell of it. Finch ignored him. The discovery electrified the house. Julian turned pale when he saw the coat. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. Mrs. Lacey collapsed into a chair. Sobbing. Dr. Bell checked her pulse with professional efficiency. It's shock, he said. Understandable. Inspector Finch began issuing orders. We'll search the riverbank thoroughly. Prepare to recover a body." Poirot remained silent. Observing the reactions, Julian looked relieved, not grief-stricken. But relieved. Margaret looked horrified, not surprised. But betrayed. Mrs. Lacey looked guilty. And Dr. Bell. Dr. Bell looked resigned. That afternoon, the river yielded nothing. No body. No trace, yet Finch was satisfied. Strong current, he declared. Could have carried her far. Poirot shook his head slightly. "You are following the coat, Inspector," he said. "Not the woman," Finch snapped. "You think this was staged?" "I do not think," Poirot replied. "I know. How?" Poirot gestured toward the house. "Because the staging lacks imagination. It is too obvious." Finch snorted. "Someone murdered her and went to all this trouble?" Poirot's eyes hardened. "Perhaps no one murdered her at all." Poirot requested another gathering, reluctantly. Finch agreed. They assembled in the drawing room. The coat laid across a chair like an accusation. Poirot addressed them calmly. "This coat," he said, "was placed to be found." Julian scoffed. "That's absurd." Poirot turned to him. "Is it? Tell me, Monsieur Julian, why was the coat placed outside when the vanishing occurred inside?" Julian opened his mouth, then closed it. Poirot continued. "If Eleanor Harrington had left of her own accord, she would have taken the coat with her. If she had been attacked inside the house, there would be signs." He spread his hands. "Instead, we have neither." Margaret whispered, "Then what happened?" Poirot's gaze softened. "Someone wished us to believe in a tragedy." Inspector Finch confronted Mrs. Lacey privately. "You packed your bags early. You had access to the coat." Mrs. Lacey wept openly. "I would never harm her." "But you helped her." Finch pressed it. Mrs. Lacey hesitated. Poirot, who had been standing silently near the door, spoke gently. "Madame Lacey," he said, "did Eleanor Harrington ask you to do something illegal?" Mrs. Lacey nodded. "Immoral?" Another nod. "Dangerous?" Tears streamed down her face. "Yes," Poirot sighed softly. "That is not the same as murder." That night. Poirot examined the photograph once more. It showed Eleanor Harrington standing beside a man younger. Intense, unfamiliar. On the back, in Eleanor's precise handwriting, Bramley, 1919. Poirot's eyes narrowed. 1919, he murmured. "After the war." He turned to Inspector Finch. "Inspector, may I ask, did Eleanor Harrington ever live elsewhere?" Finch checked his notes. "Briefly. After her marriage, there were rumors." Poirot smiled thinly. "Rumors are merely truths awaiting courage." The false trail hardened into official belief. By morning, Finch had begun drafting reports that spoke of an unfortunate accident. Poirot watched it unfold with quiet disappointment. "Inspector," he said gently, "you are allowing Christmas sentiment to cloud your judgment." Finch snapped. "And you are refusing to accept reality." Poirot bowed his head slightly. "Reality, Inspector, is rarely so obliging." He turned toward the window, where the snow was beginning to melt. "Besides," he added softly, "a woman does not erase herself without reason." That evening, Margaret sought Poirot out. "I believe you," she said. "She planned this." Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. "Why do you think so?" Margaret's voice was barely audible. "Because she told me goodbye." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "When?" "The night before Christmas Eve." "What words did she use?" Margaret swallowed. "Some endings," she said, "are kinder than truths." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes," he murmured. "Very much kinder. But not," he knew. "Safer." Part 5. The Forgotten Witness. It was the smallest voice that finally disturbed the silence. And, as Poirot well knew, Small voices often carried the greatest truths. Aye, Inspector. Finch was preparing to leave Ravenscroft when Poirot stopped him gently. "One moment, Inspector," he said. "We have not yet spoken to everyone." Finch frowned. "Everyone relevant has been questioned." Poirot's eyes twinkled faintly. "Relevance, Inspector, is a matter of perspective." He gestured toward the doorway. "Where," he asked, "is young Thomas?" Finch blinked. "Thomas?" "The gardener's boy," Poirot replied. "The one who delivers coal and clears snow." Finch scowled. "He's just a lad." Poirot smiled. "Exactly. Aye, Thomas Avery was brought in from the cold, red-cheeked, and nervous. He could not have been more than 15. His boots were still damp with snow, and his cap twisted anxiously in his hands. Poirot offered him a chair. "Sit, Mongarkin," he said kindly. "You are not in trouble." Thomas nodded vigorously. "I didn't do nothing, sir." Poirot chuckled softly. "I am sure of it. I only wish to hear what you saw." Inspector Finch crossed his arms. "You were outside on Christmas Eve?" Thomas nodded. "Clearing the back path, sir. Mrs. Harrington liked it done before dark." Poirot leaned forward. "At what time?" "Must have been just before 8. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Aye, Thomas shifted uneasily. "I saw someone by the side gate," he said. Julian stiffened. "Who?" Finch demanded. Thomas swallowed. "A woman. Wearing a coat." Poirot raised a finger. "Describe the coat." "Gray, with fur." Finch shot Poirot a triumphant look. Poirot did not return it. "And the woman?" Poirot asked softly. Thomas frowned. "It was dark, sir, but she didn't walk like Mrs. Harrington." Silence fell. "What do you mean?" Poirot asked. "She was shorter," Thomas said. "And she hurried. Mrs. Harrington always walked slow, like she owned the ground." Poirot smiled. "Yes," he murmured. "Indeed she did." Inspector Finch cleared his throat. "Could you have been mistaken?" Thomas shook his head. "No, sir. I saw her go up the side gate." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Did you see anyone else?" Thomas hesitated. "There was a man near the trees." Dr. Bell stiffened. Poirot noticed immediately. "What did this man do?" Poirot asked. "Nothing," Thomas said. "Just stood there, like he was waiting." Finch snapped. "Why didn't you say this before?" Thomas flushed. "No one asked me." Poirot spread his hands gently. "Ah," he said. "That is often the problem." The revelation unsettled everything. The coat was no longer proof of Eleanor's movements. It was a disguise. Poirot addressed Finch quietly. "The coat was worn by someone else, Inspector." "To be seen." Finch ran a hand through his hair. "You're saying Eleanor never went outside?" Poirot nodded. "Correct. Then where is she?" Poirot's voice was calm. "Still hidden. Or already gone." Poirot returned once more to the storage room. This time, he noticed something new. A faint scent. Lavender. He smiled faintly. "Mrs. Lacey." He murmured. He sought her out at once. "You lent the coat," he said gently. "Did you not?" Mrs. Lacey collapsed into tears. "She begged me," she sobbed. "She said it was the only way." Poirot nodded. "And the man by the trees?" Mrs. Lacey hesitated. "He was to help her leave." Inspector Finch stared. "Leave? Why?" Mrs. Lacey whispered. "Because someone was coming for her." Margaret, when confronted, said nothing at first. Then she spoke. Her voice steady. She believed she'd ruined a life. Poirot tilted his head. "Which life?" Margaret closed her eyes. "Her own. And someone else's." Poirot thought of the photograph. After the war, secrets buried for decades have deep roots. That night. Poirot assembled them again. "The witness we forgot," he said. "Has restored the truth." Julian protested angrily. "This proves nothing." Poirot looked at him calmly. "It proves everything, Monsieur Julian. Just not what you hoped." He turned to Finch. The coat was bait. The witness saw the decoy. Meanwhile, Eleanor Harrington departed another way. "Which way?" Finch demanded. Poirot smiled slightly. "The one no one watches." IX later, alone in his room. Poirot studied the photograph again. He turned it over. There was something new. A name. Lightly scratched beneath the ink. Arthur Poirot's eyes darkened. "Ah," he said softly. "So now we arrive at the heart." The false trail had been abandoned. And the true path, far more dangerous, lay open at last. Part 6. Christmas. Lie's Christmas Day dawned pale and fragile, like a promise already half-broken. At Ravenscroft House. The bells from the distant village church drifted faintly through the frosted air, their cheers strangely out of place among the gathered suspicions. No carols were sung, no gifts exchanged. Christmas, like Eleanor Harrington herself, felt conspicuously absent. Poirot stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Christmas," he murmured, "is a season of truth disguised as kindness." Inspector Finch, who had slept badly and knew it, grunted. "If you have something to say, Poirot, say it." Poirot turned, his expression grave. "Oh, Inspector," he replied gently, "I have many things to say. But first we must speak of lies." The lie of the coat had already been exposed. Now Poirot intended to dismantle the others, one by one. He began. "As always with the past, 1919, Poirot said aloud as they gathered in the drawing room. "An important year, non?" Dr. Bell's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Julian frowned. "What has the war got to do with this?" Poirot smiled thinly. "Everything, Monsieur Julian. Wars rearrange lives. They create debts, moral debts, which must someday be paid." He turned to Dr. Bell. "You were not always Dr. Bell of Bramley-on-Avon." Bell said nothing. "You served in France," Poirot continued. "A medical orderly. You returned. Changed." Bell's voice was controlled. "Like many men." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "But unlike most, you returned with something more than memories." Silence thickened. Margaret broke it. "You knew her before," she said softly, looking at Bell, "didn't you?" Bell closed his eyes. "Yes," he said at last. "I knew Eleanor before she was Eleanor Harrington." Inspector Finch straightened sharply. "What do you mean?" Bell's shoulders sagged. "She wasn't always a widow with a fine house," he said quietly. "She was Eleanor Marsh." Poirot nodded. "A name buried, but not forgotten." Julian stared at him. "You're lying." Bell shook his head. "I'm telling the truth for the first time in 20 years. Bell spoke slowly, as though each word cost him. "After the war, Eleanor and I were close. Too close. She was married. I was foolish." Poirot's voice was gentle. "And she became pregnant." Bell flinched. "Yes." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Julian laughed harshly. "This is absurd." Poirot raised a finger. "Patience, monsieur." Bell continued. "She lost the child. Or so she said. Soon after, she married Mr. Harrington, and she made me promise never to speak of it again." Poirot nodded. "A promise she later feared you might break." Bell's voice trembled. "No, a promise she broke." Poirot leaned forward. "She discovered something recently, did she not?" Bell met his gaze. "Yes, what?" Bell hesitated, then spoke. "The child lived." The words fell like shattered glass. Inspector Finch stared. "That's impossible." Bell shook his head. "It was adopted, quietly, illegally." Poirot's eyes glittered. And Eleanor Harrington learned the truth just weeks ago. Yes, Belle said hoarsely. Someone wrote to her. Poirot smiled grimly. Anonymous letters, typed, careful. Mrs. Lacey gasped. The letters I prepared. Poirot nodded. Confessions, madame. Or farewells. Julian rose abruptly. This is madness, he snapped. Even if it's true, what does it have to do with her disappearance? Poirot looked at him calmly. Everything, he said. Because inheritance is not merely a matter of money. It is a matter of identity. Julian froze. Poirot continued softly. If Eleanor Harrington acknowledged that child, Monsieur Julian, you would no longer be the sole heir. Julian's face drained of color. I didn't know, he whispered. Poirot regarded him steadily. But once you suspected. Julian sank back into his chair. Margaret spoke next, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She told me she was going away. To find the child. Poirot nodded. And to protect them both. Inspector Finch frowned. From whom? Poirot turned slowly to Dr. Bell. From the man who knew the truth, he said. And from the family who might destroy it. Bell looked stricken. I would never hurt her. Poirot's gaze softened. No, you would only tell the truth. And that, doctor, can be just as dangerous. Poirot stood. We now understand the lies, he said. The lie of disappearance. The lie of death. The lie of respectability. He paused, but there is one lie still unexamined. Finch frowned. Which one? Poirot smiled faintly. The lie that Eleanor Harrington was a victim. The room went utterly still. Poirot's voice was calm, almost admiring. She orchestrated this. The coat, the decoy, the timing. She planned it with care, not to escape justice but to claim it. Margaret whispered. Then she's alive. Poirot nodded. Double quotes yes, and not far. That night. Poirot wrote a letter, short, precise. He addressed it simply, to Eleanor Harrington. Wherever you have chosen to begin again, he sealed it and handed it to Inspector Finch. Have this delivered to the post office in the neighboring village, he said. It will find its way. Finch stared at him. You're certain? Poirot smiled gently. Inspector, he said, women who vanish do not wish to be lost. They wish to be understood. Poirot prepared for bed. The church bells rang again. Christmas night had come at last. Poirot looked out into the darkness. Soon, he murmured, you will return. Not to this house, but to the truth. And when you do, Poirot knew. The final lie would fall. Part 7. The second disappearance. The second disappearance occurred so quietly that, for several hours, no one noticed it at all. And that, Poirot would later observe, was precisely what made it dangerous. Christmas night passed without celebration. The house slept uneasily. Like a patient under light anesthesia, restless, murmuring, never fully unconscious. Poirot, however, slept soundly. His mind, having reached a certain clarity, required only rest. It was Inspector Finch who discovered the absence. At 7:30 the next morning. He knocked sharply on Dr. Bell's door. No answer. He knocked again. Harder. Still nothing. The handle turned easily. The room was in PTYIDR. Bell's bed was untouched. His medical bag was gone. So was his overcoat. Inspector. Finch swore under his breath. He's run, Finch said grimly. Just when we needed him. Poirot arrived moments later, immaculate as ever. Ah, he said softly, surveying the room. So the doctor has decided to make himself scarce. Finch rounded on him. You don't seem surprised. Poirot shook his head. On the contrary, Inspector, I am relieved. Relieved? Yes, because flight is a form of confession. The house erupted into confusion. Julian reacted first with anger. Typical. He's guilty, and now he's escaped. Margaret looked troubled. Or terrified. Mrs. Lacey wrung her hands. He wouldn't just leave without saying something. Poirot listened, saying nothing. Then he asked one question. Did anyone see Dr. Bell after midnight? No one had. Inspector Finch began issuing orders immediately. The roads are still blocked, but we'll send word. He can't have gone far. Poirot raised a finger. Inspector, he said gently, before we chase him, let us be certain of what he has done. Finch snapped. He vanished. That's what. Poirot smiled faintly. Precisely. Ivy Poirot returned to Eleanor's study. He opened the hidden compartment once more. The photograph was gone. Poirot nodded slowly. So, he murmured. The past has followed him. He examined the desk. One drawer was slightly ajar. Inside lay a folded piece of paper. Poirot unfolded it. Carefully. It was a prescription. Pad. Torn. Used recently. Poirot's eyes darkened. The inspector. Finch burst in moments later. We found Bell's footprints, he said, leading toward the old carriage road. Poirot followed him outside. The snow bore the story clearly, one set of prints. Careful, deliberate, heading away from Ravenscroft. Poirot crouched. These, he said softly, are the footsteps of a man who knows where he is going. Toward the river, Finch said grimly. Poirot stood slowly, or toward someone. VI halfway down the carriage road. They found the bag. Dr. Bell's medical bag lay open in the snow. Its contents were scattered. Inspector Finch bent to examine them. Looks like a struggle. Poirot shook his head. No, he said quietly. Looks like abandonment. He picked up a small vial. Empty. Poirot slipped it back into the bag. This, he said softly, was meant to be found. Finch stared at him. You think Bell staged his own disappearance? Poirot nodded. Just as Eleanor staged hers. VKI back at the house, tension sharpened dangerously. Julian confronted Poirot outright. You accused him, Julian said. Now he's gone. Poirot regarded him calmly. I accused him of knowing the truth, he replied. Not of murder. Julian's voice dropped. Then where is Eleanor? Poirot studied him for a long moment. Safe, he said. For now. Margaret stepped forward. And Dr. Bell? Poirot hesitated. Dr. Bell, he said carefully, is about to make a terrible mistake. VIII that evening. A message arrived. A boy from the neighboring village delivered it. Breathless from the cold, Inspector Finch tore it open. It was brief. I can explain. Meet me at the old chapel. Alone. Signed. A Bell. Inspector Finch looked up triumphantly. We've got him. Poirot's face was grave. This, he said softly, is not an explanation. What is it then? Poirot folded his hands. A farewell. The old chapel stood abandoned on the edge of the moor. Its roof half collapsed, its stones blackened by time. Poirot insisted on accompanying Finch. Inside. The air smelled of damp and old prayers. They found Dr. Bell, kneeling near the altar. Alive. Unarmed. Ashamed. I couldn't let her face it alone. Bell said hoarsely. Poirot stepped forward. Then you know where she is. Bell nodded slowly. Yes. Poirot's voice was gentle but unyielding. Doctor, he said, the time for running is over. Bell closed his eyes. And the time for truth, Poirot added softly, has come. Part 8. Poirot's little gray cells. Poirot sat in the drawing room. The fire casting long shadows across the walls. The snow had begun to melt, leaving the garden sodden and dark. Around him, the household waited uneasily. Even Inspector Finch, usually impatient, remained silent, aware that Poirot's mind was working, as always, in ways invisible to ordinary observers. Ms. Amos, Poirot said finally, it is time to assemble the fragments of truth. The time has come for my little gray cells to work. It began at the beginning. Christmas Eve, Poirot said. Eleanor Harrington dined with her family. All observed, all behaving as expected, yet beneath the calm, tension simmered. He gestured to Julian. You, monsieur, were concerned with inheritance, were you not? Julian shifted uncomfortably. Of course. But that had nothing to do with her disappearance. Poirot raised an elegant finger. Ah, but monsieur, it had everything to do with it. A stepmother aware of your doubts must act decisively. She understood human nature, your nature. That is why the first lie was necessary, the vanishing. Margaret swallowed. The coat, she whispered. Precisely, Poirot said. A bait. A decoy to mislead observers, including our dear inspector here. Finch scowled. I fell for it. Poirot smiled gently. Everyone does, Inspector. That is why I do not merely observe. I reconstruct. Poirot stood and moved to the floor, tracing the sequence with small motions of his hands. Step 1. Eleanor leaves the dining room ostensibly to fetch a document. Step 2. She enlists the aid of Mrs. Lacey to prepare the coat, the letters, and the false trail. Step 3. She exits via a side door known to be minimally observed, disappearing into the snow for a brief interval. He paused. During this time, the false trail was planted, the coat at the tool shed. Strategically visible, meant to imply accident or foul play. Inspector Finch muttered, brilliant. And infuriating. Poirot nodded. But this is only the beginning. Observe carefully. Step 4, Poirot continued, involves Dr. Bell. Julian's eyes widened. The doctor was instructed to create a second distraction, his disappearance. To be seen, briefly observed, and then leave a message suggesting urgency. This further misleads observers and ensures that attention is divided. Dr. Bell, seated quietly, nodded slightly. She asked me to keep the path clear for her, to make sure I drew attention. Poirot twirled his mustache. Exact, you followed her instructions to the letter, yes? Bell murmured, yes, I could not fail her. Poirot smiled. Bravo, doctor. Courage and precision, non? Poirot leaned closer to the group, his eyes sharp. Step 5. The forgotten witness. Young Thomas Avery. His observation of a figure by the side gate was genuine, yet misinterpreted by all. He saw a woman in a coat, not Eleanor herself, but an illusion created to reinforce the deception. Margaret gasped. So it was not her? Poirot shook his head. No, she was hidden elsewhere, moving with caution. The tracks, the coat, the shadows, all carefully staged. Inspector Finch gritted his teeth. It's maddening. Poirot's smile was serene. Ah, Inspector. It is also most instructive. Human behavior leaves clues, but only when one watches attentively. Poirot continued, now moving around the room as though physically demonstrating the actions. Step 6. The letters. Prepared by Mrs. Lacey, they created an expectation. Anonymous, formal, and precise. Each one suggested urgency or distress. This manipulated perception perfectly. Mrs. Lacey's face was pale. I only did what she asked. Exactly, Poirot said gently. And in doing so, you participated in genius. He turned to Julian. Step 7. Your anxiety and greed. Perfectly observed by Eleanor. She relied on human motives as instruments to amplify her deception. Your impatience, your desire for information, all used to predict reactions. Julian sank back in the chair. Speechless, Poirot's hands moved over the table, pointing to each person. Step 8. Eleanor's own exit. She traveled silently through the lesser-known corridors and passages of Ravenscroft, avoiding observation. Her destination, the small, abandoned chapel near the moor. Inspector Finch leaned forward. She went there alone? Poirot shook his head. Not entirely. Dr. Bell provided the accompaniment, visible enough to create a secondary narrative, invisible enough to preserve secrecy. The child, the letters, the truth. She went to confront, to reconcile, to protect. Margaret whispered. She wanted to meet the child. Poirot's eyes gleamed. To correct past mistakes, to bring resolution to old wounds, and to survive. Poirot straightened, glancing at each individual. And so, mes amis, you see the method. Every deception, every lie, every distraction has purpose. The disappearance was real, but orchestrated, controlled, precise. The second disappearance, Dr. Bell's, reinforces the illusion, directs suspicion, and ensures the true course remains hidden. Julian muttered. And the risk? The snow, the cold, being seen. Poirot smiled. Calculated, always calculated. Timing, opportunity, psychology. All mastered. Only my little gray cells could reconstruct it so fully. Finch groaned. You make it sound simple. Poirot bowed his head slightly. Simplicity is the art of concealing complexity. Poirot walked to the window, looking out over the snow-blanketed moor. Step 9, he said softly, the final concealment. Eleanor's brief absences, the planted evidence, and the letters, all intended to mislead observers while she approached the child safely. Each step relies upon human expectation, which she manipulates deftly. Margaret shivered. She's alive. And safe. Yes, Poirot said. Alive, safe, and in control. Which is more than can be said for those who merely observe without thought. Inspector Finch muttered, I'm going to need a drink. Poirot's smile twitched. Patience, Inspector. The truth is nearing its conclusion. Poirot concluded the session. Tomorrow, mes amis, we will gather all remaining pieces. The final revelation will unfold, and justice, or at least clarity, will be served. For now, observe and reflect. The past manipulated can be reconstructed. The future, however, demands honesty. He sat, hands clasped, eyes closing briefly. Outside, the snow continued to melt. The world beyond Ravenscroft remained cold and silent. Inside. One woman's careful orchestration had begun to reveal itself, piece by meticulous piece, and Poirot's little gray cells had never worked more diligently. Part 9. The Gathering. The Corée de Quartering. Storm had finally passed. The morning sun glimmered weakly on the snow-laden grounds of Ravenscroft House, casting a pale light across a house that still held the echoes of secrets, half-truths, and carefully staged misdirections. Poirot, impeccably dressed as always, surveyed the room. Today, everything would be revealed. He household gathered in the drawing room. Julian Harrington sat with an impatient air, Dr. Bell with a quiet tension, Margaret with apprehension, and Mrs. Lacey trembling slightly. Inspector Finch stood to one side, clutching his notebook. Though the look in his eyes suggested he had begun to appreciate the subtlety of the case, Poirot began, Mes amis. Today, the final pieces of our puzzle will fall into place. We shall examine the vanishing, both of Madame Harrington, and the deceptions that followed. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Each of you has played a role, knowingly or unknowingly, in this intricate web. Some through action, some through inaction, and some merely through your predictable behavior. Poirot turned first to Julian. Monsieur, you were concerned with inheritance. Your actions, thoughts, and reactions were anticipated and observed. Every sigh, every question, every glance toward the letters and the coat, it was as if you were dancing to a rhythm only you thought hidden. Julian's face reddened. You think I had something to do with it? Poirot shook his head. Non, monsieur. You were merely part of the stage, one whose behavior served the plot beautifully. Poirot then looked at Margaret. Mademoiselle, your loyalty to Madame Harrington is admirable. You observed, you worried, yet you did not intervene. Your small actions, the letters you prepared, your careful silence, all contributed to the illusion of disappearance. You must understand, this was never intended as cruelty, but as protection. Margaret nodded, almost imperceptibly. Understanding at last the magnitude of Eleanor's planning, Ivdr Bell was next. You, Doctor, performed the essential function of the decoy. Your disappearance, your presence at the chapel, your careful misdirection, all were necessary. Without your obedience and precision, the final act could not unfold safely. Bell looked down, his hands clasped. I did what I could, he murmured. Poirot's eyes softened. Yes, and what you did was essential. Finally, Mrs. Lacey. Madame Lacey, Poirot said gently. Your hands trembled, your conscience was burdened, but your loyalty and courage were also vital. You were asked to perform tasks that seemed trivial but were, in truth, central to the plan. Without you, the first disappearance could not have deceived all observers. Mrs. Lacey wept quietly. I only wanted to help her, she whispered. And you did, Poirot said softly. Bravely and well. Poirot then turned to Inspector Finch. Inspector, and you. Your task, though unenviable, was perhaps the most entertaining. You pursued the visible trails, examined the coat, followed the footprints, and yet you never guessed the invisible path. Bravo, that is the nature of deception. Finch scowled. I fell for it, yes. But tell me, where is she now? Poirot's lips curved into a slight smile. She is where she intended all along, safe, with the truth she sought. Hidden only briefly, to ensure safety and clarity. She will return, perhaps tomorrow. Or perhaps when the moment is right. Poirot's gaze swept the room. Now let us reconstruct, step by step, the entire sequence. He motioned toward the fireplace. Step 1. Dinner at Ravenscroft. Tensions, observations, subtle hints. Step 2. Preparation of the decoy, the coat, letters, misdirection. Step 3. Eleanor's calculated disappearance, aided by Mrs. Lacey. Step 4. Dr. Bell's decoy, staged to confuse. Step 5. Observation by the forgotten witness, whose perception was misinterpreted. Step 6. The letters, carefully composed to suggest urgency or peril. Step 7. Eleanor's secret journey to the chapel and her reunion with the child she had sought. The room was silent. Even Julian looked pale. Poirot continued. Every action, every reaction was anticipated. Each of you contributed unwittingly, yet none was culpable in harm. The vanishing was planned, deliberate, and executed with careful intelligence. Poirot stepped back, letting the weight of his explanation settle. And now, Ms. Amos, he said softly, you understand. The vanishing was never an accident. It was never a crime. It was an act of protection, reconciliation, and careful foresight. Margaret let out a quiet sigh. She was always thinking of others. Yes, Poirot said. That is why she is alive. That is why she will return when the time is correct. And that is why, Inspector, the case, though perplexing, is resolved. Finch exhaled slowly. I suppose I see that now. Outside. The snow had begun to thaw. The sun, faint and winter pale, reflected off the white landscape. Inside, Ravenscroft House was quiet, but the air felt lighter, the tension lifted. Poirot sat back in his chair, hands folded. Christmas, he murmured, reveals not only joy, but truth. And truth, mes amis, is the greatest gift of all. For now, all was calm. The vanishing had been explained. The child remained safe. The household would endure the temporary chaos, and in time, Eleanor Harrington would return to her rightful place. Poirot smiled faintly. The case, with all its intricacies, had been untangled through observation, logic, and above all, his little gray cells. Part 10. The Return, the morning after Christmas. Ravenscroft House stirred to life in a way it had not in days. The storm had passed. The snow glistened, soft and pure, melting slowly into the earth. Inside, however, the atmosphere was one of quiet anticipation, as if the house itself knew that today the final act would unfold. Poirot sat in his usual chair by the fire, perfectly composed, hands folded. His little gray cells had worked tirelessly, reconstructing every movement, every deception, every thought. And now the end was near. Margaret was the first to notice. A shadow flitted across the corridor outside the drawing room. She froze. The figure paused, hesitating. Before stepping fully into view, Eleanor Harrington. She looked unchanged, elegant, composed, yet with a softness in her eyes that spoke of relief and quiet triumph. Poirot rose slowly. "Ah, madame," he said softly, "we have awaited your return." Eleanor smiled faintly. "And I have returned, Monsieur Poirot," she replied. "Not because I was forced, but because the time was right." Julian rose abruptly, a mixture of relief and indignation on his face. "You disappeared entirely. Do you realize the chaos you caused?" Eleanor's gaze was steady. "I understand perfectly. But I also understand necessity, Julian. Every action I took was for protection, for truth, and ultimately for reconciliation." Poirot intervened gently. "Monsieur, observe the careful orchestration. The coat, the letters, Dr. Bell's disappearance, all were designed to mislead and safeguard. The chaos you perceive is, in fact, a masterful control of circumstance." Julian remained silent, subdued by Poirot's reasoning and Eleanor's presence. Poirot turned to Dr. Bell. "Doctor, you performed admirably. Without your careful cooperation, the Vanishing could have endangered her." Bell bowed his head. "I only did what she asked." "And precisely enough," Poirot said with satisfaction. Margaret stepped forward. "And the child?" she asked quietly. Eleanor's eyes softened. "Safe, and soon known to the right people. The secret I carried for decades will now be resolved, gently, carefully, and without harm. Mrs. Lacey," tears in her eyes, whispered, "you thought of everything." "Yes," Eleanor said, softly. "Everything." Poirot moved to the center of the room, hands clasped behind him. "Mes amis, the Vanishing is complete. Yet it is not a crime, nor is it tragedy. It is strategy, intelligence, and courage." Inspector Finch, finally relaxing, allowed a small smile. "I suppose I should have seen it all along." Poirot tilted his head. "Not everyone observes as one must, Inspector. But now, with the truth revealed, we may all breathe more easily." Eleanor turned to her niece. "Margaret," she said softly, "thank you for your loyalty. Your discretion and support allowed this plan to succeed." Margaret blushed. "It was nothing. I only wanted to help." Eleanor smiled. "It was everything. Sometimes the smallest actions carry the greatest weight." Julian, subdued, spoke finally. I see now. You acted wisely, though I confess my patience was sorely tested." Eleanor chuckled softly, a warm, quiet sound. "And yet you have learned, Julian. Perhaps even humility." Poirot observed the family, the staff, and the quiet, snow-filled world outside. "Christmas," he murmured, "reveals not only joy, but wisdom, courage, and truth. And in this house, the greatest gift has been the preservation of life, love, and secret reconciliations." He turned to Eleanor. "Madame, you have done well. Your vanishing was not folly, but a lesson in foresight. And now the final truth may emerge without peril." Eleanor nodded. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot." The past is reconciled. The child is safe. And I may return to the house, not as a fugitive, but as its rightful mistress, one who has controlled her fate. The household breathed a collective sigh of relief. Even Inspector Finch allowed himself a smile. "I must admit," he said, "that was ingenious." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Indeed, Inspector. And let this serve as a reminder, when observing human behavior, one must never underestimate intelligence, courage, and the clever use of little gray cells." Outside, the snow sparkled in the winter sun. Inside, Ravenscroft House felt at peace once more. The Christmas Eve vanishing had been a puzzle, a drama, a test of wit, and now it had reached its serene conclusion. Eleanor Harrington was home. The mysteries were resolved. The child was safe. The household could finally celebrate a quiet, reflective Christmas, one marked not by fear or uncertainty, but by understanding, cleverness, and a subtle, enduring joy. Poirot leaned back, folding his hands. The case was complete, and in his heart he smiled, for the vanishing had been not only solved, but orchestrated with elegance, foresight, and above all, humanity. End of Part 10. Conclusion. The story closes. Eleanor returns. The secrets reconciled. Dr. Bell's role acknowledged. The household restored, and Poirot's little gray cells prove, once again, that observation, logic, and insight can untangle even the most elaborate human deception.